Happy Friday and welcome to the last topic of Unit 3. Today we're going to be talking about the origin of life on Earth, which does relate to the chemistry and the molecules that we've been talking about. Before we begin today, I am going to have you use your notes that you took on the cartoon reading about the origins of life to discuss a few questions and see if you understood some of the information from that reading. So please read the instructions in the note on the side and go and participate in this kind of virtual class discussion activity, and then come back to complete this Ed puzzle. So the planet Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago. But you can see there wasn't life on Earth for a long, long time. As you read about, there were many things about the planet that made it unsuitable for life to begin until about 3.5 billion years ago. That's when the earliest fossils of prokaryotes, those bacteria that evolved a long time ago, have been found. And so the chemistry that we are talking about today is what happened before that, kind of leading up to those very first things that we would consider living organisms, how the first carbohydrates, nucleic acids, proteins, all of those types of things came to be, because life requires all of these biomolecules that we've been studying. The theory that life started through chemical and physical processes requires 4 steps. So this is kind of the overview, and we're going to go through the evidence that scientists have found for each of these in the next few slides. So the first thing that's necessary is that we need to be able to abiotically synthesize small organic molecules. Basically, the monomers of all of the things we've been talking about in this unit had to be able to form abiotically from things that were not organic. Secondly, we had to put those small pieces together into macromolecules. We had to be able to start building proteins and nucleic acids and carbohydrates, things like that. The third step that was necessary is those molecules had to be packaged into some kind of membrane. One of the requirements of life is that it has to be able to maintain homeostasis, maintain an internal chemistry that might be different from the external environment. So we needed kind of those earliest cells to form. And then finally, we need molecules that can self-replicate. Another characteristic of life is reproduction and being able to pass on that genetic information. So we're going to go through each of these 4 steps, starting with the formation of those smallest organic molecules. The early atmosphere on Earth consisted of water, hydrogen, ammonia, and methane. You can remember that with the acronym WHAM, W-H-A-M. That was the atmosphere of the early planet Earth. Operin and Haldane were scientists who came up with an idea, a hypothesis, about how these organic molecules might have formed. They theorized that the early atmosphere was a reducing environment. If you remember redox reactions from chemistry, oxidation and reduction, a reducing environment favored the types of reactions that added electrons to molecules, a reducing environment. In that type of environment, organic compounds could have formed from simpler molecules using energy that came from lightning or from ultraviolet radiation, which there was a lot of in the early days of planet Earth. And that created what they refer to as a primordial soup or primitive soup of little tiny organic molecules. This theory was tested by scientists named Miller and Urey. This is a famous experiment, and you read about this in that cartoon article. They used an apparatus like this to create some conditions similar to early Earth. So you can see here, this is an entire system that's closed off from the rest of the world. They have water over here to represent the ocean and a heat source to heat that up. They filled this apparatus with a mixture of gases similar to the primitive atmosphere. So they have water vapor in here, ammonia, methane, and hydrogen. And then they provided energy in the form of a spark that would be representing something like lightning in that early atmosphere. And so they set this all up, and they found that within this system, they formed some organic compounds, some amino acids, and some other monomers, building blocks of some of those organic molecules. Scientists have kind of had mixed reviews of this experiment over time. It's been hard for them to replicate it. Some people don't know if this was quite the amazing experiment that it seemed to be, but even if that is not exactly how it happened, there is evidence that the same thing could happen, even if it didn't happen all over the entire planet. It could have happened in little pockets of water near volcanoes or near thermal vents. That same kind of chemistry could happen kind of in those little microclimates that could have formed those first bits of organic molecules. There is also evidence that organic molecules sometimes arrive on planet Earth from meteorites. So it is possible that the very first monomers of organic compounds actually arrived here on a meteorite. So there are a few different ways that that first step could have happened. Once we had those building blocks available, they had to be able to start joining up into these larger macromolecules to form the proteins, nucleic acids, carbohydrates that are necessary for life. Experiments that scientists have done have shown that RNA monomers can randomly link together when the right conditions are provided to them. They also found that if you take a solution that has a bunch of amino acids or RNA nucleotides and just drip it onto hot sand or rock, which there was a lot of in the early Earth, they will automatically start joining up to create polymers. Those polymers may not have exactly the same structure as the ones found in living things today, but they could have been kind of the earliest forms of those molecules. So there are some experiments that have shown ways that those monomers could start linking together into these bigger molecules. So the next thing we had to do is be able to form some kind of protocell. These are sometimes called protobionts, because life requires reproduction and metabolism. Replicating DNA requires enzymes that requires the information in DNA. And so all of those molecules needed a place where they could kind of work together to cause those chemical reactions to happen and keep their internal chemistry stable. And scientists think this may have happened in some simple protocells similar to vesicles. When you put lipids into water with other organic molecules, these vesicles can sometimes just kind of spontaneously form. If you've ever tried to mix oil and water together, you've probably seen little droplets of oil that just float around within the water. Those are basically little tiny protocells. You get this little bubble of oil that maybe traps a little bit of water with some of those organic molecules inside of it. Those are very much like simple cells. There's also experiments that have shown that some of those vesicles have some of the early characteristics of life. Some of them are able to split and divide into two. They may be able to carry out some chemical reactions, and they might have chemistry inside of those little oil bubbles that's different from the external environment. So these were kind of the earliest, simplest types of cells, or the beginnings of them. So the last thing that's necessary is some kind of molecule that can store information, genetic information, and can copy itself, because genetic information is essential to life, and we need to be able to pass it on to reproduce life. RNA is the molecule that scientists suspect was the first main type of genetic information, for a couple reasons. First of all, RNA plays a role in protein synthesis. And so it has that information and can help make the proteins that can carry out the other functions of life. There are also molecules that exist that are called ribozymes. It's an RNA molecule, but it also has the ability to catalyze reactions. And ribozyme-like molecules still exist. Your ribosomes, those organelles in our cells today, actually contain molecules that act as catalysts, just like a ribozyme. So the reason these are important is a ribozyme is a molecule that's able to make copies of parts of the RNA, of itself. It can kind of make copies of its own instruction book. And so if these molecules were put together, these first early types of RNA that were able to make copies of themselves and could carry the information for how to make proteins, then the process of natural selection can kind of start on a molecular level right there. Any molecule that's able to copy itself and can do that quickly and accurately is going to start leaving more and more of those molecules. It's going to become more and more common within that environment. And if there were mutations or mistakes that made that happen more quickly or more accurately, then over time these molecules will become more efficient at copying themselves and at accurately replicating. And so that leads to this theory called the RNA world. Scientists believe that the first forms of genetic material were most likely RNA. And so the earliest life forms on the planet, or the protobionts, those not quite living things, but almost, had RNA as their main genetic material. Because if there was a vesicle, if we had one of those protocells that had within it some self-replicating RNA that could also catalyze chemical reactions, then that vesicle, that little protocell, could grow, it could divide, and it could pass on that RNA. It wouldn't have a lot of genetic information, but those few inherited characteristics, those few proteins that were coded for by that little bit of RNA, would be acted on by natural selection. If they were helpful to the survival of that little cell, then they would be passed on, and if not, then they would not. And over time, those RNA molecules could have been the template for the first DNA. There could have been mutations that in time altered an RNA molecule into what we now know as DNA. It turns out that DNA replicates itself more accurately and is a more stable molecule. So once those mutations happened that kind of created the first DNA, they would quickly replicate more accurately, more frequently, and would kind of take over and become the dominant type of genetic information once they appeared. So that is what scientists currently think about the earliest origins of life. We're actually going to continue this story a little bit at the beginning of next unit and talk about how these very earliest simple protocells gave rise to what we now know as prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. But this is the end of Unit 3. Make sure you finish up your catalase lab by tonight, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend.